The Mountains of Blades. In the cool morning air of the Swiss Alps, when fog drifts across the valleys and bells echo from distant pastures, it is easy to imagine another century. A time when every man you met along these winding paths wore a sword at his side. Not as a decoration, nor as an affectation, but because the law demanded it. Switzerland, in the early days of its confederation, was not the peaceful, neutral land of watches and chocolate we think of today. It was a loose gathering of mountain communities surrounded by powerful neighbours. In the late 1300s and early 1400s, the valleys were battlegrounds for survival. Out of this tension grew a rule, both practical and peculiar. A citizen's duty was to be armed, always. The sword was a tool of necessity. Roads were unsafe, bandits prowled the trade routes between cantons, and there was no central army to rush to anyone's aid. When the tocsin bell rang from a church tower, every able man was expected to appear ready to fight, blade in hand. Thus, carrying a sword became as routine as wearing a coat. But this rule, that every Swiss man must bear arms in public, was more than a safety measure. It was a reflection of identity. The Swiss believed deeply in the idea that freedom was self-defense made visible. To walk unarmed was, in their eyes, to neglect one's responsibility to the community. The origins of this belief lay in the earliest oaths that bound the Alpine cantons together. In the late 1300s, leaders from Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden met to swear mutual defence. They pledged not to serve kings or lords, but to defend their valleys together. Their symbol was not a crown, but the sword, the instrument through which equality and duty were expressed. Over time, this concept hardened into law. By the early 1500s, civic statutes in many Swiss towns explicitly required all adult males to carry a sword when appearing in public. In some places, the rule extended even to church services and markets. The weapon was a badge of citizenship. It marked the bearer as someone trusted to uphold the peace, not threaten it. Foreign visitors found the sight remarkable. Travellers from France and Italy wrote of villages where farmers tilled the fields with swords hanging from their belts, and merchants bargained over cheese and cloth while hilts glinted at their sides. They described the people as stern but orderly, armed yet tranquil. It was, they said, a nation of warriors without wars. At first glance, such a society seems paradoxical, yet the Swiss saw harmony in it. The sword at every hip was a reminder that peace was maintained through mutual respect. When everyone bore arms, courtesy became essential. Harsh words could escalate into bloodshed, so men learned restraint, patience, and careful speech. The blade, paradoxically, taught civility. The earliest references to the law appear in cantonal ordinances from the late 1400s, preserved in archives in Zurich and Lucerne. They describe penalties for appearing before council unarmed, or venturing into the market without sword or halberd. These were not empty threats. Fines were levied, and repeated offenders could lose civic rights. Readiness was the measure of a man's honour. In these rugged communities, strength and independence were virtues more precious than gold. Every household owned at least one sword. Young men, upon reaching maturity, were expected to craft or purchase their own. In wealthier towns, blacksmiths competed to create fine, balanced blades. In poorer valleys, weapons were plain and functional, forged from the same metal used for farm tools. But the purpose was the same: to serve when called. By the time the 1500s arrived, the law was deeply woven into daily life. A man might leave his cottage at dawn with a loaf of bread in one hand and a sword swinging at his hip. The clang of metal against a buckle was as ordinary as the creak of cartwheels or the bark of dogs. The sight of armed citizens gave the country an appearance both disciplined and formidable. Outsiders quickly learned that invading such a land would mean facing not an army, but an entire population ready to defend itself. Yet beneath this discipline lay a quieter philosophy. The sword law was not about aggression, but equality. It declared that no noble or soldier held a monopoly on defence. Every citizen was a guardian of his own liberty. The farmer and the mayor, the herdsman and the merchant, each bore the same weapon and the same duty. This idea, radical for its time, was the foundation of Switzerland's enduring independence. As the 15th century drew to a close, the rule of the sword stood as both practical law and cultural creed. The men of the Confederation carried their blades not merely to enforce authority, but to embody it. The sword was the state, shining, disciplined, and in the hands of the people. The making of the citizen soldier. By the early 1500s, Switzerland had already earned a fierce reputation across Europe. The Confederation's soldiers, lean men from the mountains, armed with pikes and long swords, had fought and won against armies far larger and richer. Their discipline astonished foreign commanders. How, they wondered, could these simple farmers fight like professionals? The answer lay in the way Switzerland raised its men. From the day a boy could lift a blade, he was trained not for conquest, but for readiness. The sword was not an instrument of war, it was part of daily life. In small villages, nestled between peaks, children watched their fathers oil the family sword each week. The blade was treated almost like a family heirloom, cared for with reverence. When a son came of age, he was presented with his own, sometimes newly forged, sometimes passed down through generations. The moment was both intimate and civic. A quiet rite of passage, unadorned yet profound. To be handed a sword was to be handed trust. It meant that the community believed you were now strong enough, responsible enough and disciplined enough to bear the duties of manhood. The weapon was a reminder that liberty could not be borrowed. It had to be carried. Training in arms was woven into everyday routine. Sundays after church might include practice drills in the village square. Men gathered with pikes, crossbows and swords, learning formations that had been perfected in countless battles. Children looked on, dreaming of the day they would stand in the line themselves. Such scenes were not acts of militarism, but of community. The drills reinforced unity, rhythm, and equality. When they marched in step, they did so not for a monarch, but for one another. The law requiring the carrying of swords grew naturally from this ethos. It ensured that every man was always prepared, that the tools of defense were never far from reach. In cities like Zurich, Basel and Bern, it became unthinkable for a citizen to appear in public without his weapon. In the cantonal records, there are detailed descriptions of how these laws were enforced. Market inspectors, known as Weibel, patrolled gatherings to ensure compliance. They could issue on-the-spot fines to anyone found unarmed. This may sound strict, yet the people accepted it without protest. In their minds, it was common sense. To go about without a sword was like leaving one's house unlocked at night. It was a failure of prudence, not defiance of authority. Foreign observers, especially those from France and the Italian states, often described their astonishment. One chronicler from Milan in the early 1500s wrote that the Swiss walk among themselves as equals, for all carry the sword and none fear the other. Another from Burgundy noted with surprise that tavern quarrels rarely became violent, despite the abundance of weapons. They hold their tongues with care, he wrote, for each man knows his neighbour is armed. This balance between readiness and restraint fascinated outsiders. The sword law seemed both a paradox and a solution. It made violence impossible by making it universal. At the heart of this strange harmony was the idea of the citizen soldier. The Swiss were among the first in Europe to formalize this concept, that defense was not the privilege of a class, but the obligation of all. The sword on a man's hip was a visible sign of that obligation. It blurred the lines between civilian and warrior. A farmer could be a soldier at a moment's notice. A merchant could defend his stall as fiercely as a knight defended his castle. There was dignity in that equality. It bound the cantons together in a shared sense of strength. Over time, the sword itself began to take on symbolic meaning. Swiss art from the period often depicted the sword not in battle scenes, but in peaceful hands, a farmer leaning on his blade, a councilman resting it across his knees during deliberation. The message was clear. The weapon was not for violence, but for vigilance. In some cantons, the sword law extended into civic ceremonies. During elections or council assemblies, men entered with swords visible at their sides, as if to remind one another that authority rested not on crowns or coins, but on mutual readiness. To govern was to guard, and yet the law's enforcement was rarely harsh. It thrived on custom more than coercion. In smaller villages, there were no written penalties, only social expectation. An unarmed man in a crowd might draw curious glances or quiet disapproval. He might even be gently mocked, but he was rarely punished. The law was self-sustaining because it lived in the minds of the people. By the mid-1500s, Switzerland's reputation as a land of disciplined freemen had spread far and wide. Popes employed Swiss guards. Kings sought Swiss mercenaries. Their discipline, born from the daily habit of being armed yet peaceful, made them legendary. When the French chronicler Philippe de Comines wrote of them, he called the Swiss a people both mild and terrible. Mild in manner, terrible in resolve. It was precisely that paradox that the sword law embodied. As the Confederation grew wealthier and more stable, some cantons began to question whether the rule was still necessary. Yet few dared repeal it outright. To do so would seem like rejecting the values that had made the Swiss who they were. The sword was more than a weapon. It was a promise made visible, the promise of independence. In time, this custom would face challenges from changing technology and new ideas of governance. But for now, in the quiet towns and high valleys, the rhythm of daily life continued. The blacksmith's hammer ringing, the markets bustling, and the steady gleam of steel at every man's side. The law in everyday life. By the middle of the 1500s, the Swiss rule requiring men to carry a sword in public was so deeply woven into daily life that few even thought of it as a law anymore. It had become a rhythm, as ordinary as dawn light on the mountains or the tolling of church bells. Every morning, in towns from Zurich to Geneva, the same scene repeated itself. Men stepped out of their homes with a sword hanging from their belts, its hilt catching the light as they walked down cobbled lanes. Bakers carried blades beside baskets of bread. Farmers led their cattle through the streets with iron glinting at their sides. Even in quiet villages, where the mountains rose close and life moved slowly, the habit remained the same. The sword was part of the body, a symbol as much as a safeguard. It was so normal that a man without one seemed incomplete. In some cantons, it was said that a man without a sword walks without his shadow. In the markets, the sight was striking. Merchants bargained over salt, cheese and wool, their hands resting casually on the pommels of their blades. Visitors often remarked on how polite the Swiss were during disputes. Voices seldom rose. Arguments, when they occurred, ended quickly. The presence of a sword on every hip had a curious effect. It enforced civility. Each man knew the cost of anger. Words were measured like precious coins. This quiet restraint became part of the Swiss character. The sword did not make them violent. It made them careful. It reminded them that strength, when carried by all, must be tempered by respect. In towns like Bern and Lucerne, there were even public rules for how and where one could wear a sword. Certain religious buildings required that weapons be left at the entrance, hung neatly on wooden racks before entering. It was a gesture of reverence, not prohibition, a recognition that faith and readiness could coexist. The same applied to weddings, funerals, and feast days. Men would attend armed, but once the ceremony began, the swords were sheathed and laid aside. There was dignity in discipline. Despite the ubiquity of weapons, serious violence was rare. Duels were frowned upon, and in many cantons explicitly banned. The sword was not a toy of honour, but a tool of duty. Drawing it in anger without lawful cause could bring heavy fines or imprisonment. Even so, these punishments were seldom needed. The culture itself kept men restrained. A sword was something to wear, not to wield. In smaller alpine villages, the law took on a communal flavour. Elders inspected young men's weapons to ensure they were maintained. If a sword was rusty or dull, it reflected poorly on the owner's character. A neglected blade, they said, belongs to a neglected man. Regular care of one's weapon became a sign of responsibility. Husbands might polish their blades beside the fire in the evening while their wives mended clothes, a domestic ritual both humble and symbolic. Foreign travellers described these scenes with fascination. An English merchant visiting Basel in the late 1500s wrote in his diary that every man seemeth a soldier, yet there is no army. He noted how peaceable the people were, despite the abundance of steel. They go to market as others go to battle, but with smiles, not fury. The sword law also influenced Swiss craftsmanship. Blacksmiths flourished. In towns like Solothurn and Thun, workshops produced blades admired across Europe for their balance and simplicity. Unlike the ornate weapons of Italian nobles or German princes, Swiss swords were functional, built for endurance rather than display. They reflected the values of their owners: sturdy, honest, unpretentious. Carrying a sword even shaped Swiss clothing. Tailors cut coats and tunics with slits and loops designed to accommodate scabbards. A good outfit was not complete without the right way to wear one's weapon. Swords were often passed down through families, and their scabbards were personalized. Some engraved with initials, others marked with small carvings of animals, crosses, or family emblems. It gave each blade a quiet individuality. The sword law did not only regulate the visible act of carrying a weapon, it also fostered an invisible code of behavior. It encouraged moderation, self-control, and mutual respect. A man who carried a sword had to know when not to use it. That restraint became one of the most admired Swiss virtues. The law even extended into governance. During council meetings in the cantons, members were expected to arrive armed. The gesture was symbolic. Authority and defense were one and the same. Decisions about peace, trade, and justice were made by men who understood the weight of a weapon. To bear a sword while speaking for the community reminded each representative of his duty: to protect, not to rule. In many ways, the rule captured the essence of the Swiss Republic long before the modern state existed. Power was distributed, shared, and personal. Every man's blade was a small fragment of sovereignty. Together, those fragments formed a collective shield. As the 1500s turned toward the 1600s, the world around Switzerland began to change. Firearms were spreading. Cannons thundered in wars between empires. But in the valleys, the people still carried swords. Not because they were the best weapons, they were not, but because the sword had become a symbol of continuity. It connected the living to their ancestors. It reminded them of the oaths sworn centuries earlier beneath the mountain pines. The Swiss sword law at this point was no longer just about defense. It was about memory. Each blade was a quiet echo of independence, a promise made by generations past and carried forward by those who still believed in it. And so, as the centuries turned and the winds of modernity began to sweep through Europe, Switzerland held fast to its tradition of armed peace, a paradox that had become its strength. The decline of the sword law. By the dawn of the 1700s, Switzerland had changed. The once fractured confederation of mountain cantons had become a prosperous, self-confident republic. The people were still proud of their independence, but the world around them no longer resembled the one their ancestors had known. Gunpowder had altered the very meaning of war. The long pikes and shining swords that had once made the Swiss feared across Europe were now giving way to muskets and cannons. Battlefields had grown louder, faster, more impersonal. The elegant art of swordsmanship began to fade into ritual. Yet the old law lingered, still requiring every man to carry a blade when he stepped into the public square. For generations, it had been more than a rule. It was tradition, almost sacred. But as life became safer and trade routes more secure, the habit began to feel outdated. Travellers and diplomats visiting from France or Austria sometimes chuckled at the sight of Swiss farmers still armed with swords while leading their cows to pasture. "They live," one visitor wrote in the early 1700s, as though the Middle Ages had not yet ended. In the cities, the law began to loosen. Merchants and scholars, increasingly influenced by Enlightenment ideas, questioned whether the constant carrying of swords served any real purpose. Crime was rare, and the cantons were at peace. Maintaining such a rule, they argued, was like wearing armour to a dinner table. Still, in rural valleys and small towns, the tradition held firm. There, the sword was less a weapon than a symbol of dignity. To be seen without it was to seem careless or unmanly. An aging blacksmith in Uri was once quoted saying, "A man without his sword is a bell without its clapper. He may look whole, but he cannot sound." But times were changing. Muskets now hung in homes beside the old blades. Younger men preferred the new firearms. The sword felt like a relic. In some cantons, especially Zurich and Vaud, the rule was quietly rewritten to allow citizens to carry arms of suitable type, which often meant pistols or rifles. The word sword faded from the documents, but its spirit lingered in the phrase to be properly armed. Even as the weapon itself disappeared, the habit of readiness remained. Men still drilled in village squares, though with muskets instead of swords. The underlying principle that the defence of the nation was the duty of every man stayed unchanged. The sword had merely evolved into a new form. By the middle of the 1700s, the law existed mostly on paper. Enforcement had become symbolic. In some cantons, officials would still fine those who appeared completely unarmed at official gatherings, but the rule was rarely tested. Life in Switzerland had grown peaceful, and the Confederation's neutrality kept it untouched by many of the continent's wars. This transformation from blade to principle reflected something deeper. The sword law had never truly been about the weapon itself. It was about responsibility, the notion that freedom must be guarded by the people who enjoy it. The tool had changed, the duty had not. In that same century, the Enlightenment swept through Europe, and with it came a new language of civic virtue. Swiss philosophers wrote of citizenship not in terms of arms, but of participation and conscience. To be a good citizen no longer meant carrying a sword. It meant serving the community through education, fairness, and work. Yet these modern ideals grew from the same root as the old law, that liberty requires effort. Still, there were those who missed the old ways. In the mountain cantons, where change arrived slowly, men continued to wear swords on feast days or at weddings. The blades had become ceremonial, polished, engraved, and passed down as heirlooms. They were no longer tools of defence, but of memory. In a sense, the swords outlived the law. Families kept them as reminders of who they were, descendants of free men who had never bowed to a king. On the walls of farmhouses, swords hung beside crucifixes and family crests. Each one told a silent story of duty and independence. By the late 1700s, when the rest of Europe was caught up in revolution, Switzerland stood apart, quiet, watchful, self-contained. The law that had once armed every man now existed mostly in spirit. but its influence could still be seen in the way the people governed themselves. Their councils remained small and local. Their militia system endured. And the idea that the citizen and the soldier were one and the same continued to shape Swiss identity. When the modern Swiss constitution finally emerged in the early 1800s, it no longer mentioned swords, but it preserved the same expectation that had driven the ancient law, that the defence of the nation would be shared by all. Military service was not a burden imposed from above, but a right and a duty belonging to every citizen. The sword had simply changed shape into a rifle, a uniform, a tradition of readiness that survives to this day. And so, as the old steel grew rusty and was laid to rest in museums, the spirit that forged it remained alive. The law was gone, but the lesson endured, that peace is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Legacy of the sword. When the law that had once required every Swiss man to carry a sword in public finally faded from the statutes in the early 1800s, few noticed its passing. It had already transformed, quietly and completely, from a rule into a memory. Yet its influence lingered everywhere, in the nation's customs, its character, and even its modern institutions. The swords themselves did not vanish. In homes throughout the valleys they remained, polished, oiled, and proudly displayed. Some were hung above fireplaces, others placed in wooden chests beside family records and baptismal documents. Many bore scratches and nicks that told the story of long use, though few had ever drawn blood in anger. They had been carried for centuries, not to threaten, but to remind. The idea that every citizen shared the burden of defence had shaped Switzerland from the inside out. It created a culture where independence was not declared from above, but lived from below. Each man's readiness was a small thread in the fabric of national peace. By the middle of the 1900s, that same principle had evolved into the modern militia system. Every able-bodied Swiss man was expected to serve, trained not as a professional soldier, but as a guardian of the Republic. Rifles replaced swords, and drills replaced marches through market squares, but the spirit was the same. The Swiss were still a nation of citizen soldiers, disciplined, calm, and prepared. Foreign observers continued to marvel at this quiet paradox. How could a country so armed remain so peaceful? The answer was the same as it had been 5 centuries before. Mutual respect born from shared responsibility. The people trusted one another because they all carried, in one form or another, the same duty. In museums across Switzerland today, the old swords rest in glass cases. Long, simple blades of steel and iron, their hilts worn smooth by countless hands. Visitors lean in close to read the small plaques describing their origins. Few realize that these relics represent more than craftsmanship. They are fragments of a national philosophy, one that turned weapons into emblems of equality. The legacy of the sword law is not one of violence, but of balance. It stands as a reminder that peace, to endure, must be built on readiness. Not the readiness of aggression, but of responsibility. The Swiss carried their swords not because they wished to fight, but because they wished to remain free. In a world ruled by kings and emperors, they believed that freedom could exist only when defended by the people themselves. That belief survived the centuries. It survived the fall of monarchies, the rise of republics, the revolutions and wars that swept across Europe. It even survived the transition from swords to rifles, from blades to ballots. The tool changed, but the trust remained. Today, when a Swiss citizen completes military service and returns home, he keeps his equipment as a sign of civic honor, much as his ancestors once kept their swords. It is not a symbol of power, but of belonging. The idea that security comes from participation, not submission, is woven deeply into Swiss identity. And so, though no law now commands it, one might say that the people still carry their swords, invisible but present. They carry them in their sense of duty, their calm insistence on neutrality, their shared belief that peace is best preserved by those who are prepared to defend it. If you walk through a Swiss town today, through the narrow streets of Lucerne or the quiet lanes of Appenzell, you may see a sword hanging above a doorway or displayed in a cafe. It gleams faintly in the light, no longer a threat, but a keepsake, a whisper from the past. It speaks of a time when every man walked armed, not because he feared his neighbor, but because he trusted him. When the weight of liberty rested not in the hands of rulers, but in the strength of ordinary people. The absurdity of the old law, that every man must carry a sword, conceals a deeper wisdom. It teaches that peace and freedom do not come from disarmament or domination, but from discipline shared by all. The sword, once required by law, became unnecessary only when its lesson had been learned. And so, the story closes where it began, in the shadow of the mountains, where bells still echo across the valleys. The blades have grown silent, the law has faded, but the spirit endures. Switzerland remains what it has always been. A land guarded not by kings or standing armies, but by its people. Calm, prepared, and free.